And we're live. So I'm here with Diane, Danny, and Emma, and we're going to talk about how MRAs and feminists can work together. And then I think we'll start with the positives. Then we'll go on to the things which are potentially standing in our way. So maybe we should start with people telling us a bit about themselves. Do you want to start, Emma?
Sure. I'm not sure what about myself should I tell? What's there to know?
Well, you call yourself a feminist, is that true?
No, I don't really call myself anything when it comes to the gender stuff. I kind of there's a lot of stuff I agree and disagree with both sides on. So
I thought I read an article you posted on Twitter the other week. I think it was from earlier this year where you said you're a feminist or you want to reclaim
yeah,
the word feminist.
I used to. It wasn't. I did identify as one until fairly recently. But
So you're more of an
I kind of
egalitarian?
dropped that a while back. Yeah, I guess so. That would be one way to put it. If I think there's a problem, I'll talk about that. If I think one side isn't being fair to another, I'll talk about that. So, it's whatever.
Yep, cool. And Danny?
Yeah, hi. I'm a YouTuber. I talk about a range of political topics, but on this one, I fall pretty solidly into the MRA camp. I mean, I consider myself an egalitarian and also a women's rights advocate as well. But I do talk about men's rights issues quite a lot and things like that.
And Diane?
Yeah, I am very much a feminist.
Did you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself? You've written online articles before?
Yes, I have written online articles on a range of things, mainly gender feminism, because that's what that's my passion and that's my thought. But I've written about all kinds of things. I've written about race, popular culture. I've even written about schools in London, all kinds of things, really. Yeah.
And you're very open-minded to men's issues as well.
Yes, that's very much something that's part of my feminism. I mean, I believe in equal rights for men and women, and that's a case of either we all have the same privileges and opportunities and forfeits as well, or we all have none. The reason why I got into feminism is because I believe in everyone being empowered, and for me, feminism was the vehicle for me to realise my own potential as a woman.
Well, I think we can all agree that everyone should be equal and have equal rights and responsibilities and opportunities.
Yeah, definitely.
So we all agree on that. That's good. So I guess that's the good starting point. The thing is, how do we achieve that?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of different issues that feminists do tend to side with a lot of men's rights activists on. I mean, so the one that I was mentioning to Bane just before we started here, so male circumcision is usually a men's rights issue that feminists tend to be, to agree is something that needs to be stopped. Would you both agree with that?
Yeah.
Yes, I would, although, to be honest, as a feminist, it's not something that I've necessarily just looked at from a gender perspective. What you find is that in some cases, the campaign against male circumcision, it's mainly to do with it being seen as child abuse, rather than necessarily a male issue or a gender issue. So, there's different perspectives. I've mentioned on previous chats with Bane that part of the reason I disagree with it is partly ethnic grounds. My background is Nigerian, which is a very pro male circumcision background, and for me, that's part of my misgivings. Comes from my intimate knowledge of that and seeing the experience of that within my own family. So that's the thing. There are different reasons why someone may be against a particular issue, and I think that complicates, in a way, who can work together and how they work together to combat, particular issues.
I think circumcision's a tricky one because there are feminists which are obviously against it, and there are feminists who are for it, and there are feminists who don't really care one way or the other. And unfortunately, there's men's rights activists who fall into those three categories as well. The ones that tend to be pro circumcision tend to come from America, so it tends to be a cultural thing, and it's quite hard to try to convince someone in that situation.
It's funny with the circumcision thing, actually, for me, because I've never come across a feminist that hasn't been against male circumcision, though I'm sure they exist. But I have seen a few being apologetic about female.
Female
Yes.
things. Oh, you mean on the grounds of like cultural relativism, etc.?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I have noticed that as well. And I do agree, Diane, before that it is a human rights issue. The reason that I think that it makes some sense to frame it as a men's rights issue is because in most Western countries, at least, it's of course considered unacceptable, as it should be, to do it to a girl, where it's not considered unacceptable to do it to a boy. So that would make it a matter of equal rights, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, but like Bane said, it depends on the country. Rates of male circumcision are not uniform throughout the West. It's a lot more common in America, for example, than in Britain for various reasons. I do see why it would be seen as more of a men's issue than a women's. Personally, for me, it's more, my concern of it is more that it's done to, partly that it's a matter of injury that's unnecessary, but also that it's done to a child who can't vouch for themselves. I mean, for me, the problem with saying that it's a men's issue is the fact that if a man were to do it as a man, well, then you'd be able to choose as an adult, regardless of whether it was a good thing for you to do or not. So in a way, if anything, it's probably, for me, I see it as more of an issue of a child's right to bodily integrity.
Okay, that does seem fair. I'd just be interested. So there are a lot of feminist groups who do campaign for an end to female circumcision in the few places that it does still happen, and they do consider that to be a women's rights issue. Would you also contest that?
I would say to some extent, yes, because it tends to be done on girls that are very young, and part of the reason why is because they're less likely to rebel against it and say no. That said, it depends on the ethnic group that practices it, because there are some that specifically do it to young teenage girls or young women before marriage. They do it as a premarital right. For example, if you take the ethic of Nigeria, well, they do it to girls who went into what's called a fattening house. And that means it's a place where you prepare for marriage by being fed a lot of bread to fatten yourself up. There you get taught how to be a good wife, how to cook and clean and maintain the household, but you would also be circumcised as well. And that wasn't done to 5-year-olds or 10-year-olds. It was usually done to older teenage girls and perhaps young women. So it does depend on, the problem with that is that it depends on the practices, whereas male circumcision tends to be done on baby boys.
Not always, though. In parts of Africa, it's actually done on teenage boys.
Yeah, that's true. I know. I've heard about South African, tribes that do. I think the Sosa, but yeah, I mean,
it's the same in Australia with the Aboriginals. They tend to do it in when the boys are teenagers.
Well, yes, I mean again, it's a rite of passage, if not premarital, then one that initiates them into adulthood. Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose you could see it that way as a men's rights issue or a female's rights issue. I think also that the differentiation that feminists make is that female circumcision is unfortunately more likely to result in fatalities. It's more likely to result in death and, severe complications, partly due to the parts of the body being cut and the way they're cut, but also due to certain bodily processes like menstruation and childbirth, which make the after effects, such as the scarring, blood clots and what have you, a lot more potentially life-threatening.
I've seen some information on that showing that female circumcision does tend to happen to result in fatality more often. However, that is comparing the female circumcision in third world countries where that it's sort of done ritualistically with no medical sterile environment, etc. Comparing that to doing a circumcision in a hospital in the middle of a megacity. It's that. So it's. I don't think it's exactly clear that one is inherently more dangerous than the other.
And often when baby boys in the West, when they're circumcised and they die days later, it's because of infection or blood loss or something like that, and it's not chalked up to the actual circumcision, which is what caused the infection or the blood loss. So
it depends on, to put it crudely, what's being cut and how. If you're just cutting the foreskin, just the outside skin, obviously it is an injury, but you don't get as much tissue damage as
I disagree with that, Diane, because the male foreskin has actually more nerve endings in it than the fingertips. So, and one of the procedures done on females is just the removal of the clitoral hood, which doesn't have anywhere near as many.
I'm talking about as an infection site. As an infection site, a clitoris is more vulnerable than vagina because it's covered by membrane. It's not covered by skin. That's what I'm speaking about. I'm not talking about nerves and what have you.
Okay.
Infection site.
Well, and if you're just talking about the sort of the amount of tissue damage, like the foreskin is roughly about a third of the skin of the penis.
Yeah.
So that is a significant amount of tissue damage.
I'm not saying it isn't. I'm not saying it isn't at all. There is obviously damage, but I'm saying that because of the nature of female anatomy and male anatomy, because of certain differences, and like I said, for example, men don't give birth, and that is one thing that complicates the after effects of certain circumcision procedures, like infibulation. If you know what that means, when the vagina is sewn up, when after much of that and the labia has been removed. Now, you don't have to be a genius or an obstetrician to work out why giving birth through a vagina that has literally been sealed up shut might be a problem.
That is true, and well, the thing is though that is a very rare kind of female genital mutilation as compared to, for example, the removal of the clitoral hood. There are forms of male genital mutilation. For example, Aboriginal Australians have a practice where they will essentially flay the entire penis. It's if you want to see, look
Nobody
for
looked it up.
flaying.
I did it once and regretted it.
No, you probably don't want to see it. But if you have a morbid sense of curiosity,
I have men end up urinating, from the underside of their penis. Yeah, it's very expensive. Most circumcision, say in America, isn't to that level.
It sounds like it couldn't be worse than what Danny described, but it really is.
Yeah.
Quite expensive, but then, at the same time, there are different types of circumcision. Now, I don't think in America or Britain or in most parts of the world where male circumcision is practiced, it is to that level. I don't think the procedure is as major as that. I do know and not just the penis, it's testicular crushing as well, going to baby boys. Again,
I don't know when it comes to females what what percentage of people that undergo it have what type. I would need to look at that. But
so
there definitely are differences, of course.
The percentages of it, as far as I know, the most common form of male circumcision is just removal of the foreskin. The most common iteration of female circumcision is removal of the clitoral hood. I could be slightly wrong on that, but that is what I recall. But the important factor for me is that so there was some suggestion in the UK, I believe, actually, that was made by a few doctors saying that they could, to appease the parents of, so the Muslim parents who wanted to have their girls circumcised, that they would do a ritualistic nick, and that was protested against. And as it should be.
That's type 4, actually, that one. Type 4 is any other nicks or cuts or scraping.
Yeah.
Yes, and that was protested against, very rightly so. Whereas in that exact same country, it is totally legal for the parents to entirely remove the male's baby's foreskin, which is, I suppose, just bringing it back around to the men's rights. That's why I would render it as a gender equality issue.
But they're also talking about banning adult women in England from getting labiaplasty and genital piercings because technically it falls under type 4. So it just amazes me that there is talk about banning adult women.
Of course, the important difference is that's something you're choosing to do.
Yeah, as an adult, but no one really gives a shit about newborn baby boys who don't have a say. It's incredible that the I don't even know how to describe it. The fact that we can try to
Yeah, it is
wrong and bodily integrity, but at the same time, I can see why. I think it's a case of people see baby boys as being less delicate than baby girls. You know, I mean, one excuse people have for male circumcision is probably heard is that, well, it doesn't hurt them as much because they're babies. You know, it will hurt less if you do it then than when they're much older, which is obviously crap. Obviously, it hurts even more because the baby's nervous system is less developed and less able to counteract pain. It's just that babies can't speak, so they can't tell you how much it hurts.
Well, they often go into shock.
Yeah.
So they're told, the doctor says, he slept right through it, but he's actually gone into shock. And there's studies which have shown that the baby is less likely to bond with the mother afterwards. So, I mean, that's a great first memory in life, isn't it? Or first great experience.
True, but it's also a matter of hygiene. People assume that boys are dirtier than girls, that men are dirtier than women. And so people say, well, they justify it mainly on the grounds of hygiene. You know, men don't wash their dicks properly. So if you go with their foreskin, it won't be all nasty and smeggy.
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of rather strange justifications that are made for it. Circumcision's often been described as a cure in search of a disease. You know, it's been justified at many different times for many different reasons, and it seems that a simpler explanation of that would just be that it's a practice that had become culturally ingrained, and people just wanted to find some justification for it.
It's actually an interesting.
In Britain is the hygiene. I think in Britain, what you find the most common justification for doing it to boys is the hygiene. The fact that boys are dirty, they don't keep their dicks clean. For me, it's not a good enough excuse, especially in a country where sanitation is universal. There's no reason why a boy or man can't keep his genitals clean. It's not an excuse.
Yeah, it's a rather silly excuse. I mean, you wouldn't advocate someone chop off a baby's entire outer ear so that he doesn't have to clean behind his ears. I mean, chopping off the bits so you don't have to wash it is a rather silly point. So, I mean, even if we might disagree on exactly how to render it, whether as an equality issue or simply as a human rights issue, then I think it's still something that at least we hear, and it seems most feminists do seem to agree with most MRAs on. Is there a women's rights issue that feminists think that feminists would like MRAs to back them up on?
That's a good question. I think there probably are, but I don't know what they are. I think a lot of feminists probably don't even contemplate or will have even considered, you know, the idea of unity with the MRM on a particular issue. I think they probably would on a lot of things. Would probably like that backup, but I don't know. I mean, to be honest, one thing I thought is, do feminists or MRAs even necessarily want to team up? I think it's a nice idea. I think it's a good idea in some ways, but then I think some people really enjoy the antagonism. You know, they enjoy
definitely
and moan about. They enjoy having an enemy because it helps them reaffirm their own position and why they believe certain things that they do believe. I really do think that some people enjoy, they thrive on the theatrics of battle.
Right.
So,
well,
I think there are some things that we'll never agree on, but I do think there are some things that we can work on, and I think coming together and working on them isn't a bad thing. But as far as disagreeing on certain things, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing either, because I think it's good having a different side to keep your side honest.
Oh, I do.
Other opinions.
And it's just a shame that there are, I think, a lot of people that, you know, they might both agree that they don't like a certain thing, they might both care about a certain issue, but that just won't want to cooperate together on that because things that they disagree. And I think you're right that it's okay to disagree, but
we can maintain a debate.
People that are just like, no, I just don't want to talk to them.
Right. We can maintain a debate on where we disagree whilst still pushing for a change that we do agree on. I don't think that's too far-fetched a concept.
No, and we all want equality, don't we? So we should be able to agree on some things and work together on some things.
Yeah. So there are some men's rights issues that I think it would be a little bit more questionable, but I'm interested in hearing your take, Diane, as a feminist, and also Emma as a former feminist, sort of feminist, not really. So for example, child custody. This one's a little bit less. I'm less sure that you're going to be on the men's rights side for this, because essentially in most countries, women are sort of the assumed caregiver by law. Now, this is something that originally was put in place due to feminist campaigns to some extent. So it's not that all feminists would necessarily agree with that, but and that there are definitely feminists now who are against it. But I mean, do you think that reforming the custody law in Western countries is a worthy cause?
Absolutely. I've always believed that custody should be shared. Men deserve access to their kids as long as they're not violent or abusive, or they're not a danger to their child. I don't see why they shouldn't have access and the ability to care for their child. I mean, obviously, feminists have, campaigned for women to, be the caregiver and granted custody, but I don't think that's the only reason why mothers are given that privilege. I think part of the reason why is that, bear in mind that laws doesn't progress at the same rate as society in general. What you find is that most lawyers are men, most judges in these cases, in divorce cases, are men, and they are still operating under very archaic beliefs about the family.
Can I pull you up on something there, Diane? Now, the largest feminist organization in America has actively been fighting against shared custody for over 15 years now.
Well, yeah, so I'm talking about, not even so much America, but from a British perspective, you know, the way our criminal justice system is that it's taken a lot longer for them to catch up to certain social changes, say in terms of attitudes towards rape. For example, you look at the police, they reformed their attitude towards rape a lot sooner than the criminal justice in terms of prosecuting certain types of rape, say, like for example, within marriage. Sorry, getting back to the issue, yeah, I know about the NOW. I don't think that's right at all. I don't agree. I know that Karen DeCrow, a prominent member of the NOW, campaigned against it, and she defended a man who wanted to be granted access, and I think custody of his children. I don't agree with that, but again, I think it's partly about a continuum for the child. You know, the fact is most women bear the brunt of childcare, and I think it's about maintaining basically certain patterns that children have experienced at a time when their life is in upheaval. You know, if mother did most of the caring beforehand, we'll make sure she keeps doing it afterwards so that the child has some sort of consistency in their life. Again, I don't think that will necessarily last, especially with men taking a greater role in childcare, and obviously with paternal leave. You know, you have parental leave, more men are taking it up slowly, but I do think things are changing for the better. So
shouldn't we start with 50-50 custody, and if one parent wants less, then that can be negotiated, but start with an equal starting point and then work from there?
Yes, I think, I think what's more of an issue is more how you, I think the issue of 50-50 as well is premises. Part of the reason why is that it's assumed that the man moves out into a smaller flat or house while the woman stays in the main house or the main residence with the children. I think what the parents would have to do, not necessarily through legal means, is decide, well, how they're going to divide the 50-50, you know, are they going to, who is going to live where? Is it going to be the children with the dad 1 week and with the mum the next week? How they allocate the time, because that plays a major part in particularly in the finances, which is a major factor with custody. You know, if dad is going to have the kids 50-50, he's going to have to get a big place rather than a little flat or bed sit, you know, that he stays in before, you know, coming to the main house to see his kids or taking them out on the weekend. I think greater use of mediation services is going to help as well. But yeah, I have always believed in 50-50, but the question is with each couple is how do they decide that? Because I think, you know, richer couples is going to be easier in terms of arranging a residence and time, but also it depends on their working patterns as well. You know, some people say that the parent who earns more money or works more, you know, should they be getting as much time with their children as the parent that doesn't? I think,
but that's why 50-50 should be a starting point. It doesn't have to be set in stone.
I think there are, I think there's issues as well. And it depends on, and also I think it also depends on why each, you know, why the relationship or the marriage broke down in the first place as well.
Right. But with the essential equality idea, though, in most legal systems, it is set up so that the woman will have, in many ways, preferential treatment by a custody hearing. So, would you be in favour of ending that, trying to remove laws which would slant it towards the woman getting custody?
Yeah.
Right.
Without doubt.
Great. Well, we've got two issues, two men's rights issues that so far we're on board with.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly a personal thing because I actually used to work. I actually had a colleague who was part of Fathers for Justice. That's a British group, I think it's called Fathers for Justice. Well, they're known for, you know, scaling buildings dressed as Superman and, you know, Batman and things like that. But, you know, this was an issue very close to his heart. And it wasn't even, it was his wife that left as well. You know, his wife left with the children after being unfaithful. So I've seen it from not just, you know, I'm not just looking from a feminist point of view, but also a more personal one as well. I never have anyhow, although to be fair, I am biased because if I had children, that's what I'd want anyway. You know, I could very much envisage and, you know, myself wanting time away from my children, a life of my own, as well as, you know, motherhood. So obviously shared custody would allow me as a woman to have more of that.
Okay, so you think that shared custody, equalising the court battles in terms of custody could actually have a positive effect for women as well?
Oh, I think it does, yes.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. It would help to even out the wage gap a bit, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, although that's another complicated issue. I think, you know, that's partly due to sexism, but there's also certain things, but also certain ways in which women themselves or ourselves contribute to not earning as much, such as, you know, not asking as often for pay rises or for specializing in fields that are not as well paid.
It's also,
you know,
taking time off raising kids is one of the major factors.
True, that is a major one. But there's lots of things. There's even, you know, there's even things like, you know, not just old boys network, but the office culture. You know, the fact is that if you're a woman and say you're not interested in, say, golf or certain more activities that men are more likely to be interested in, that could exclude you socially, because that means you miss out on certain networking opportunities that can often lead to promotion or learning more about the company or certain opportunities that might otherwise help you advance in your career. Well, like I said, it's a complicated issue, the whole wage gap thing.
So can I offer another one that I think we'll agree on, which is the draft?
Okay, yeah.
I think we'd probably all agree that the draft should be done away with, but if there is a draft, then it should be for everyone and not just half the population.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although I think, I mean, although what I find interesting is that there's very many different sections of society that are against it for different reasons. There are some feminists that are for it, some that are against a draft for both sexes. That includes both sexes. I'm very much one that's for. That said, I do think that even if that were the case, the army will still be slanted population-wise in terms of men, just by virtue of them being stronger and faster. But I absolutely think it should be a case of both sexes being drawn up for it.
Right, I don't think
being recruited.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would have a problem with men being the majority of the army if it's simply for meritocratic reasons. That they're just they're more likely to be in that sort of top tier of physical fitness that you'd want for a soldier. But in terms of the draft, there's actually an argument in favor of going down the route of making it for everyone as opposed to removing it, because it would essentially have the same effect. Do you think it's very likely that a politician is going to be able to enact a draft if women are going to be drafted too?
Well, that's
I
what's
think that
happening.
would be kind of political.
Aren't they passing that?
They're passing it, but I think that what that's going to mean is that they will never actually institute the draft. They've put it so that it's on the books legally that if they institute a draft, it'll be for everyone. But I think that means that they'll never institute a draft. So I think it has the same effect as just removing the draft.
Should we go on to domestic violence?
Yeah.
What about it?
Well,
Well-
this was actually one I took a quick look at before I came on. So I did a quick Google round to see a few sites to see if there was anyone already talking about MRAs and feminists actually coming together on some issues. And one of them was was essentially saying that they liked the idea. It was a feminist website. They liked the idea, but that they wouldn't be happy with working together with Paul Elam as their specific demon. The reason there being that there were these posters that said that women or domestic violence, women are half the problem, that Paul Elam was supporting. And it was taken to mean that this is that women are to blame for being hit, when of course, I mean, what those posters of course mean is that women are about half of domestic abusers, right? So I mean, I imagine that would all sort of disagree with the Duluth model, for example.
Okay.
Who is that?
It's essentially the way that the police currently
Because I hear everyone mention it all the time, and I feel like I've come from context, I kind of laid it out to me.
Okay, the Duluth model was I guess a theory which was created, I think, in the early 90s, where basically a group of feminists from Duluth interviewed female victims and male perpetrators, and then came to the conclusion that domestic violence is gendered. And one of the things I think they list as one of the reasons is male privilege or something like that. So, and this spread right across the Western world and is now used by police forces and the rest as their guide to how to deal with domestic abuse. So it gets a lot of criticism from MRAs for that reason, because it's clearly gendered and biased. Yeah. Whereas our stance tends to be that domestic violence is generational, it's not gendered as in something men do to women because of male privilege or patriarchy or whatever. Abusers tend to come from abusive backgrounds, and that's both men and women.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of that there. I mean, obviously there are people that don't, but it's definitely a significant factor.
Yeah, I'm talking in general terms, but
Yeah.
I mean that's what Aaron Pitsey discovered back in the 70s when she opened up the first women's shelter in England. So I think. Sorry, go on.
From her own perspective, especially because she came from a violent family. Actually, part of the reason she feels the way she did is because her mum, as did her father. So that's partly why she didn't see violence as gendered. I wouldn't necessarily put say that it isn't necessarily just a gender thing, but I do think culture does play a part in the prevalence of violence. I mean, if you look at, say, in America, for example, you're more likely to find certain crimes in the South, say men committing murder with guns in the South, and that has been linked to a culture of honor. And also, I think it has to play a part in some ways. I mean, even the law plays a part. Once upon a time in England, men were legally allowed to beat their wives. It's where we get the same rule of thumb from, because men were allowed to.
That's actually an urban myth, Diane.
What, the 1869 law about men?
Are you talking about beating a woman with a rod, which is the width of your thumb?
Yeah, no thicker than the.
Yeah, that's actually an urban myth.
Is that so?
Yeah, Christina Hoff Sommers has debunked that ages ago.
The most common, the most widely accepted by historians origin for that is carpentry, about using the width of your thumb to measure something. as opposed to using a ruler, like a rule of thumb, using your thumb to measure something as opposed to using a ruler, so you're just sort of roughly doing it, but it's good enough.
Okay, but why do you think that culture, that it's just purely generational, that violence is, you say violence is generational, how come? I mean, that's people were saying that it's generational, but the fact is there are people in a family who come from violent families, they may have violent parents, but not necessarily be violent themselves.
Yeah, it wouldn't be 100% sort of thing. I mean, no aspect of sociology ever is. You don't necessarily put one action in and get the same result out every single time. You can only sort of see trends and generalities, and it does seem to be a very strong trend that someone who is the victim of abuse when they're young is more likely to also be a perpetrator later in life.
Or to be a victim and put up with it, as opposed to, leave the situation.
Mm.
So they're more likely to stick around. I'm sure I remember Erin Pitsey talking about that, where she said that women who aren't from an abusive background, when they're given the chance to leave, they will leave and move on, whereas the ones from an abusive background will return to the abuse. And I think she said something about it's almost like they're addicted to it. That they're used to the fighting. That's normal for them.
And I mean, that's how something becomes normal. If it was your experience growing up, it sort of seems like it is just the way things happen. If that's how situations were resolved, if there's some conflict and it was resolved in your home growing up with violence, then I mean, of course, that's going to be influence how you look to resolve situations in the future, or how you respond to other people trying to resolve situations that way in the future.
Yes, but then how would you explain differences in who perpetrates it other than necessarily family? Like if you take, for example, the fact is that men are statistically more likely to perpetrate domestic violence than women. How would you explain that?
That depends on the statistics that you look at.
Yeah, I haven't seen any consistent statistics on that. I've seen statistics showing it both ways. It really depends partially on who's collecting the data and also on their definition of domestic violence.
Well, okay. Well, personally, I do believe that men are more likely to. I think men, I really strongly believe that. And I'd say that for women, this difference in size between men and women is too much of a deterrent.
Well, but there's also a massive deterrent.
But I think it's too much of a deterrent in terms of starting a fight with somebody.
Diane, you can look on YouTube and find plenty of videos of women who are 5'2", smacking a 6 foot tall guy in the face repeatedly. I just saw one today actually, and the guy won't hit back.
Yeah, it's.
I didn't see incidences of women hitting men. Of course there are. I'm talking about generally. I would say women are generally too intimidated by men's greater strength and size for it to be the other way around.
Yeah, but
I don't think that intimidation. Yeah, it's not. Intimidation isn't the only factor, because it's also whether or not you're going to be too scared to hit someone is also dependent on whether or not you think that they're likely to hit you back. And it certainly is the case that boys are taught to not hit girls. Not that that's a bad thing, but just that there is much more social taboo around a boy hitting a girl than a girl hitting a boy. So it is quite. You can see it would be quite common for a woman to be able to hit a man without expecting any retaliation, right?
Then girls are also socialized to be more passive and to avoid confrontation.
Sure, there are a lot of factors which would go into it.
I remember seeing an English documentary about women in the police force in England, and there was a female police officer who said that men are far less likely to be violent towards her because she's a woman. They're more likely to hit a male officer. And I think she was like 5'4" or something. The strange thing, or the funny thing is, in that same documentary, there was a teenage girl who hit her and knocked her out because, yeah, I mean, the female police officer wasn't very tall, wasn't very well built, but she didn't have to put up with the same amount of violence as the male officers, in her own words.
Yes, but then I don't. To be fair, she's a police officer, and that may have factored into her being attacked, not necessarily her sex. It depends on the situation. To be honest, unless you have a double blind method where you could say the situations she was in were exactly the same as the male officer, and you could make an absolute direct comparison, then I don't really think that's just her word. I'm not saying that she's lying, but it's not exactly a very scientific analysis.
That's true, but so you were referring before, Diane, to the way that women may be intimidated by men because they tend to be physically weaker, and so therefore are less likely to be the perpetrators of domestic violence. And that is one effect that would probably come into it. The point, though, is that there are lots of effects that would push it the other direction, and it's not really clear which way it's going to end up. There are a lot of reasons that men would be less likely to hit women than women hitting men. And I think that outside of the statistics, it's not really clear which one is going to be more prevalent, since there are so many factors that would push it one way or the other. And to me, the solution there is to not treat it as a gendered issue as the legal system currently does.
Okay, true, but then I do think that sex does play a part in certain instances. Not necessarily, not directly, but I think it does affect the way certain services are allocated. But for example, one of the reasons why you're more likely to have women's refuges than you are men's, obviously attitudes do play a part, but one of the reasons why is that men are less likely to be financially dependent on an abusive spouse or partner. And the issue of finances is one of the reasons why people do not leave or cannot leave abusive relationships.
Okay, Diane, look at it this way. Let's say a man is in an abusive relationship with a woman and they have kids, right? He can't leave and take the kids with him, can he? Because if he does, he's going to get in trouble for basically taking the kids away from the mother. The courts aren't going to come down on his side. But the mother can do that. Alternatively, he can leave by himself and leave the kids in an abusive relationship with the mother, or he can stay there and put up with it. And if he does want to leave, his options are basically to go to one of the very few shelters scattered across the Western world, or alternatively go to a homeless shelter, which is where most male victims of domestic abuse turn up.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and if he actually tries to ring up to get services to help him as a victim, he'll be referred to services for abusers.
Well, no, that's not necessarily the case. Well, I don't know about in Australia, but I know that in Britain things are changing. I mean, even feminist services now, or articles, for example, you'll see a lot more advertising for where men can go if they're experiencing group abuse or certain issues. Even if the article is specifically about female sufferers, you see a lot more.
But that's only the last couple of years that started to happen.
True. Yeah,
and that's because we've been basically out there screaming that what about the male victims? What about the other side? And it's obviously had an effect, which is good.
True, but then there's also the factor that if a man's been hit by a woman, because of the size issue, a man is far more likely to be able to fight off a woman than a woman fighting off a man. Now, he may not necessarily do so, but as a general rule, he has that option at least. He's more likely to have that option.
I don't know. I think a lot of domestic abuse victims are beaten down emotionally as well as physically. And women are more likely to use weapons as well. So...
Yes, but in terms of physically restraining an abuser, who is more likely to be able to...
And if he does, and he leaves a bruise on her wrist while he's trying to stop her from hitting him, and the police turn up, then he gets arrested.
True, but then in the immediate... Yes, but that's in the aftermath. In the immediate situation, your safety is more important. And the
point is that he knows that that could happen, right? He in the situation where he's being abused, he may not fight back specifically because he knows that if he does, there could be repercussions.
True, but he at least has that option. At least it is there.
The option to be arrested?
Even if you do get arrested, at least you're still alive. If you're able to restrain the woman that's beating you and who could potentially stab you, yeah, it's that arrest is wrong and it's dealt with. But then you're not going to be able to deal with that if you've been stabbed to death by this abusive wife or girlfriend.
So your options are to get stabbed to death or to be arrested for being a victim.
No, but yeah, the arrest is wrong, but you deal with that after. Your safety and keeping yourself alive is the most important thing. Yeah, the arrest is wrong. It needs to be dealt with and defended against. But I'm just saying about the option of defense in the immediate situation of being...
Well, in that case, I think that on the purpose of this hangout to find things that we agree on, if you're saying that the arrest is wrong, well, that would be against the current way that law enforcement does tend to deal with these sorts of situations, and it is a change that MRAs do advocate for. So I suppose that is another thing to chalk up for things that we actually agree on.
Okay.
But not all feminists do agree on that point, though, Danny. That's the point.
That's true.
There was a law change in America, I think, in the late 90s. And the number of women being arrested skyrocketed, which caused another law change brought in by feminist lobbyists. So now it's the dominant aggressor laws, which are in over there. So basically one of the factors is who is the bigger of the two people, which is, most of the time the man. So even if the man is the victim, the police turn up and most of the time will end up arresting the man.
Yeah. I know that does happen a lot. Okay.
So, right. I mean, that's one of the things we as MRAs talk about a lot, and we tend to get a lot of criticism for it too. So.
Yeah, that is wrong, and hopefully that will not last.
But that's one of the problems of seeing it as a gendered thing as opposed to a generational thing.
True, but then I think also the issue as well is how it's been reported. Because I think part of the reason men are arrested more, it is partly, prejudice on the part of the police and sexist beliefs, but then also it also depends on the intelligence they get. How is that crime being reported? If people say a neighbor who rang the police might say they heard a woman screaming, they might have said, well, the woman's screaming because she's being killed. Oh, I don't know what's happening to her. When she's, of course, it may be her screaming at the man that she's abusing, whereas the neighbor's reporting it as her screaming because they think she's the one being attacked. I think it's not just the prejudice of the police or the criminal justice system, but also society in general that contributes to men being arrested more, well, at least in this particular instance.
Yeah, I agree. And there's been, I think we've all seen the videos where a man is hitting a woman in public and people will jump in, and when they reverse it, people tend to walk by and laugh.
Yeah. I've seen that.
So, I mean, that's the attitude we have to change.
I have not seen it done that way around, but I have seen the ones with the woman being hit.
Oh, you haven't seen the one where a woman hits a man and people either laugh or cheer as they're walking by?
No, it doesn't surprise me though, unfortunately.
There's one famous one where, they have the man hitting the woman and people intervene, and then they swap it, and people are walking by, and one woman, as she's walking by, kind of cheers, like, yeah, that's great, give it to him, type thing.
You go, girlfriend.
Yeah. I'll find it for you and send it to you afterwards.
What do you think?
Yeah,
would make
check it out later.
for a man? Sorry, you were saying, Emma. What do you think would make?
There's a delay, I think.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on, Diane.
Sorry.
No, I was saying that what would you do, or what do you think could be done to make people want to step in to help a man the way they did for the woman in that situation? I don't think it's right. I think it's just as bad. Although, to be honest, I'd like to see a fight break out of that nature. I don't know what I would do, whether I would necessarily directly intervene, especially if I didn't know how the fight broke out, because then you don't know who started the fight and who needs to be defended necessarily.
Well, I think we need.
Would you be questioning who started it as much if it was the guy doing the hitting?
No, because to me, whoever fights is the one. Obviously, is obviously not the person to defend. But that's the thing. If you didn't see the fight start, how do you know who you should stand up for and who you shouldn't? That would be my concern.
Yeah,
well,
but I just mean, I wonder if you or I or whoever, if we came across a fight and we saw a woman getting hit, I don't think we would question. I think we would assume that she didn't start it and that he started it.
I would. I definitely would. And quite frankly, even I wouldn't defend a woman in that instance. If she started the fight, she was beaten bad by a man, I would never, ever defend a woman. In fact, I've even taken the side of a man doing it to my own sister.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, that's a situation where I would say that I would help the woman or the man. And essentially, I think it doesn't... It was said in the chat, actually, by Sir Zofiel, it doesn't matter who started it, you stop it. And I'd be inclined to agree. I think that if I feel as though I can intervene, if I'm physically capable of intervening and preventing the person getting hit from getting hit, then I'm going to do that. And if maybe the person getting hit actually started it, but nonetheless, I don't want them to get hit.
Well, no, but if they started the fight, then why should I care? Yeah. They put it on themselves, in my opinion.
Okay, well, I'd still rather they didn't get hit. But I suppose that's sort of moving away from a gendered thing. Anyway.
Hey, you make your bed as you lie in your bed as you make it, as far as I'm concerned. You don't start what you can't finish. If you hit somebody, why shouldn't you expect to be hit back?
You probably should be, but I don't think that I'd let the fight go on anyway. I think that if I can stop it, then I would.
Okay, well, that's your stance. That's
you don't really have time to stop last question.
But I think the point is the difference between people's reactions to a female victim and a male victim, or a male perpetrator and a female perpetrator.
Yeah, that's just what I was trying to get at.
We're more likely to have
just anyone, like, we just kind of naturally have different assumptions when we see it one way around.
Yeah, and that's the thing we have to change.
It's part of the issue, isn't it, I suppose? Yeah.
Okay, but how would you go about it as an MRA?
Changing those opinions. Information.
We bleed and we hurt. I mean, that's the thing. People have been saying this all the time, about how boys do cry and what have you. That's all very well, but I don't see how any society is progressing towards making a real sea change in terms of men's general emotionality or their ability to express themselves. I mean, yeah, you do have like, organizations like CALM, Campaign Against Living Miserably and things against male suicide. But in terms of society or the way people, raise boys, I don't really see a difference, quite frankly. It's just the same old thing over again. Men are vulnerable. yeah, okay, we got that. What else?
Well, I don't think we as a society have got that. That's the problem. I think we're slowly starting to, but it's a generational thing. And in the last year or so, I've seen a lot more talk about male suicide, which is a good thing. So we have to
That's a good
create.
thing. But I don't really think people are yet implementing changes that will make a real difference in terms of culture, in terms of the way men see themselves culturally.
Well,
I
you
mean,
have to
there are
spread awareness first.
not a lot, not enough, quite frankly. To me, it seems so stagnated.
Although I will say that I am perhaps a little pessimistic. I don't think that we will ever get to the point where someone is going to be as shocked by a man getting hit as a woman getting hit. I think in general, people are going to be more worried about the woman getting hit, and that it seems to be basically just biological. I don't really see that
I kind
changing
of think
completely.
that way as well. I think we should still try to effect change as much as possible, but I think there's always going to be a slight bias there for sure.
Yeah, and definitely the legal system can change because there are currently discrepancies in the actual laws, and that's something we can focus on and address.
But I think we'd agree that a slight bias, which is probably a genetic thing too, is probably a lot better than a massive bias, which we have now.
Yeah, it's better than a culturally reinforced one, certainly.
So what do we do about shelters and things like that? I mean, I think there are more shelters starting to open in England the UK for men.
Yes, there are. They're still few and far between. I think it's partly a matter of geography as well, because that affects funding. You know, I mean, the fact is, if say you only get very few men in a particular area needing a refuge compared to the amount of women, say in the city, then, you know, people have to decide how funds are going to be allocated in terms of building a refuge and those kinds of services. I think what also complicates things is the way in which people mentally process abuse. And I think what it is in men is that they're more likely to necessarily turn to drugs and alcohol in the aftermath of abuse to cope with it or to mentally escape from it. So I think what you find is a lot of social services and medical services will treat the alcoholism and the drug abuse as the reasons for a man becoming homeless, and not necessarily perhaps the abuse that led to him turning to substance abuse as a coping mechanism. I personally don't know how social services is going to cope with this problem, especially because there is a lot less funding. You know, there's a lot, especially from taxation, and a lot of services have been cut, some that I've even experienced personally as a disabled person. I don't know how it's going to be managed, but I do think people are starting to take domestic violence suffered by men more seriously. You do see more articles about it, especially more female writers advocating for more support for male sufferers. The question is how things are going to change legally and to some extent socially.
Step by step, I guess. But spreading awareness is the first step. Always, people have to know that there's an issue before you can change, public opinion, and then that eventually flows on to the politicians. But that takes time.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, is that the criminal justice system and to some extent politics, the legal system, I should say the legislative really, is that they often take longer to catch up to certain social changes.
So whatever. Should we go into another issue, or did you want to add something, Danny? Sorry, I cut you off there.
I was essentially just going to agree. Like the law lags sort of a few years behind the culture.
Yes, as usual.
Well, I think that's understandable. You can't really change the law every time
Yeah.
the culture swings one way or the other. So I can kind of understand it. And it also has to wait until the majority of the culture shifts in that particular way. That takes time. I mean, have a look at gay marriage. How long has that taken? 30, 40 years as an issue?
Yeah. Yeah, it's I mean, New Zealand seems to switch it all at once. We did it quite quietly. I think we thought that the world sort of saw us as a kind of a progressive country, so we just didn't tell anyone and just pretended it had always been like that. But it was actually only, I don't know, it was within my lifetime, but I can't actually remember how long ago it was. We've already forgotten. Pretend it was always that way.
Legalized same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was in 2013. Yeah,
13, yeah.
not
Not
too
that
long
long
ago.
No.
But yeah, I think that's definitely something that the whole gay rights thing has been going for like 30 years, but the marriage thing really sped up. It's really sped up in the last 5 or so.
Yeah, because I think you eventually reach a tipping point where it becomes everyone knows what the issues are, and they start to agree with it, and it's a generational change.
People realize that it's not this terrible thing, and
and then you reach that tipping point. But it takes awareness first.
Yeah, and then finally politicians will realize that it's political suicide for them not to support it, and so they'll support it.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Sorry.
Now, so sometimes the law can work the other way around. Like, for example, in England, we got rid of the death penalty. I think it was in the 60s, late 60s, and that has helped reduce widespread support for the death penalty. Although I think most British people do still want it to be reintroduced.
Yeah, I'm personally against the death penalty. There's probably going to be a lot of people listening who would disagree with me, but
I agree with it.
Yeah, I'm against the death penalty as well. I hope there's no one listening who disagrees with that.
Yeah, it's a very controversial topic, I think. It splits people one way or the other.
Yeah.
I don't know, I think it does differ a bit with geography, I think.
Right, I mean, if you're an American, you're significantly more likely to believe in the death penalty, which is strange, because they're meant to be libertarian, smaller government, give their government the power to kill its own citizens.
Yeah, but it depends on the state too, so it changes from place to place. But let's not get into the death penalty.
No, this is a general politics.
Yeah, and it's not really a gendered thing either, I suppose.
So the last hour is going to be Islam and the death penalty. Discuss.
How can you do that in an hour?
Yeah, well, Islam. See, actually, when I mentioned,
I was joking. Don't end that rabbit hole.
Don't go to Islam roll. Okay.
It's my favourite road.
It's nice rabbit.
So, we've got any other topics that we can discuss? Men's issues. Sentencing gap.
Right.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Well,
I think
it's not good, but you know what I mean.
5 feminists talk about it.
Well, my position essentially on the sentencing gap is essentially that I think the problem stems from the discretion that judges are given. There are going to be a lot of biases. One of them will be bias towards, being more willing to punish a man than a woman. But it'll also be, there could be racial biases. There could be all sorts of biases. And once you're giving just a person essentially the ability to arbitrarily, somewhat within bounds, but to some extent arbitrarily determine sentences, I think that you're going to let all of those human biases in. So my essential position is that we should be trying to remove the discretion of a judge to determine sentences. There should be some system in place to determine the appropriate punishment for a crime as opposed to the discretion of a judge.
Well, yes, but then I think, isn't that there already? I mean, in Britain, you have tariffs that are set by the legislative. so that judges can't set arbitrary sentences, especially for major crimes like murder?
There are bounds, as far as I understand it, there are bounds within which they can determine the sentences, but they still do have significant discretion, which is, you can see in the statistics, it's something where if you're male, then you'll get a heavier sentence by a large amount. There's also some evidence that in the US, if you're black, then you'll get a harsher sentence as well. And there are a lot of those sorts of biases do tend to come into it, because as much as we do set bounds, like there's an upper and lower limit, there's maximum and minimum sentences for given crimes, for example, the judge does have discretion within those bounds.
True. I think for me, my issue is that I don't agree with sentencing when the crimes are commensurate. I think that if, the circumstances are the same, your reasons are the same and whatnot, then obviously you should get the same, the same sort of sentence as a male convict would get in that situation. But I think with certain crimes, there are certain reasons why male offenders do get worse or longer sentences, I should say, than female perpetrators. Like if you take, for example, sex offences, one of the reasons why is that male offenders are more likely to use threats or violence during the commission of a crime than a female one. That is obviously not a question of equal, the crime being commensurate or equal to each other.
Right, but I mean, using violence during a crime is going to change what the crime is. So if you take a look at the statistics and you see that for the same crime, a man is going to be given a harsher sentence, then it would take that violence into account, would it not?
Well, yes, but what I mean is that it's the same sexual offence. Like if you take, for example, flashing, the women do flash. But the fact is, when women flash, it's not usually coupled with aggression, such as like screaming at your victim, "Suck daddy's dick," or something like that. It's not normally. That's part of the reason why male flashers get worse sentences than female ones. It's when women do flash, which is obviously just as wrong. It's not coupled with aggression towards the victim in the same way that male flashers often do.
But Diane, Sonia Starr's study took into account the crime and the criminal history and all the other factors. So she compared like crimes to like crimes, and she found that men get 63% longer sentences for the exact same crimes and are twice as likely to be convicted.
Okay.
And if you look at things like females who sexually molest teenage boys, they often get suspended sentences. There was recently a case where a 37-year-old woman got I think a 13 or 14-year-old boy drunk and had sex with him, and I think it was her lawyer said something along the lines of, well, she's not a pedophile. She normally doesn't find young boys attractive, but she was drunk. So, and she got a suspended sentence.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. But then again, sex offences are often where there are glaring differences in terms of how male and female offenders commit their crimes. And even
but if we're talking about a 37-year-old man who got a 14-year-old girl drunk and then had sex with her, and he somehow got a suspended sentence, there would be an outrage in society.
Yes, but then there have been cases of men getting extremely lenient sentences for sexual abuse. I mean, there's one case in America where a man had raped his daughter for 4 years and he got a 60-day sentence.
Yeah, and usually there's an outrage for those things.
Yeah, it is wrong. There is, I mean, I do think that, there are certain ideas about statutory rape and how it's not as bad for a boy and what have you. But there are certain reasons why male offenders in some cases do get worse sentences. It's a known fact that male statutory rapists are more likely to use threats and they're also more likely to have done it on more than one occasion. How would you explain that?
I seem to remember a lot of cases of teachers in America, actually, female teachers who have slept with their students. So they're in a position of authority, of power, taking advantage of their students. And some of them have slept with numerous students.
True, but also female teachers in that position are also more likely to fess up straight away, and they're also statistically far less likely to blame the victim in that situation.
I've heard some of them say he was so manly that I couldn't help myself and things like that. Actually, I think one of them left her daughter behind, who was still a baby, and fled with this 14-year-old to Mexico. And her excuse was he was so manly. I know he was 14, but he was so manly. So, I mean, we get that excuse as well.
True.
It's an incredible double standard.
Maturity level, you do see that maturity excuse used more towards females. You do see used towards teenagers, especially being accosted by older men. They say, well, girls mature much faster. Oh, they must have thought they looked older, even though they were wearing school uniform at the time. And not even necessarily a case of statutory rape, even just sexual harassment, even when it's really a lot of bollocks. The thing about sexual offense, again, it's a complex thing, but then there are reasons why that sentencing gap has arisen that are partly to do with the perpetrator, but then also to do with social attitudes as well. Quite frankly, I think more of the issue is why they're allowed to happen in the first place. Why are they so prevalent? That's my gambit, quite frankly. I don't really care who's doing it. It's all wrong, as far as I'm concerned.
Look, I agree it's all wrong, but I think we should just look at the case and the facts and the evidence, and the race of the person or the gender of the person should not be a factor as to whether the person is guilty, whether they get a jail sentence, or how long that sentence is.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's obviously what's meant to happen, but this is not an ideal world, is it?
No, but the question is, how do we fix that?
No, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, especially the criminal justice system, because obviously judges and lawyers are trained they're trained to be impartial. I don't know what, I mean, obviously reform needs to happen, but I don't know what more could be done to ensure that lack of bias.
Well, there are people who are trying to get women less sentences. They want less women. They want to shut down women's prisons in some cases.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I think it's funny you said actually women get less sentences. I think part of the reason why women, actually that is a known fact, one of the reasons why women get lesser sentences in some cases, because they're more likely to be responsible for raising children, and judges are less willing to part the main caregiver from children.
Well, I mean, that's an entirely different issue that is worth bringing up, because in a lot of cases, if the father had committed some of these crimes, especially the sexual offences, the judge would be all too happy to part that child from its main caregiver, even if the father is the main caregiver. I would argue that if a mother does commit, especially if it's a sexual offence of some kind, that there is a very strong argument for maybe giving custody to the father or some other measure like that. And parting the mother from the baby in that case doesn't seem like a terrible thing, does it?
No, but then you do see judges who use the whole parenting, the whole situation of being a parent as a reason to give lesser sentences. I've seen that happen, for example, in drink driving. People have been driving drunk with their child, whether they're male or a female parent, and they've avoided jail because the judge has said, well, the guilt you feel is punishment enough, which I think is bollocks. I think, if anything, they should be thrown in jail, because of all the kids in the world you should be protecting, it should be your own. quite frankly.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I think it can work. It depends on the case. I think it can work in favour of some fathers, because I think if the father was very, very involved with his children, or say unusually was the primary caregiver, he had custody of kids, I think that might work in his favour in terms of sentencing. I think even fatherhood even helps. I think it even helps in terms of reforming a criminal, because it's a known fact that maintaining relationships with children when you're in prison greatly reduces the rates of recidivism. So yeah, I think in a way it's a good bias. In a way it can be useful, that consideration of parenting, you know, being included in sentencing, but in other ways it really isn't. I think it depends. I think it has a role. It can be incorporated, but I don't think it should. I don't think it should impede justice. You know, that's the most important thing.
Well, I mean, so I suppose this is coming from the sentencing gap. Like, going back to the beginning of that, someone in the chat did mention a case that did happen in New Zealand, where a woman sexually abused her 1-year-old son, and filmed it and sold the video, who was sentenced to a year's post-detention conditions and 100 hours of community service. Now, obviously, this is a rather extreme case, but such a case, I don't know if you'd definitely agree, but I would assume you'd agree that that wouldn't happen with a man. Like you're not going to find a similar case where a man sexually abuses a 1-year-old, sells the video, and is sentenced to 100 hours of community work and a year's home detention.
Well, I've not heard of any. Well, it's unlikely, I guess, but I've not heard of any such case involving a man. I've never heard of this case before. Why was she?
Do you think that is symptomatic of the way that women would be treated more lightly by the legal system?
I would say yes, but again, it's for varying reasons. Partly bias, but partly the nature of the crime, exactly what happens, the way it's committed.
Sure, but I mean, there's no details I could add to that particular crime, for example, that's going to make you think that punishment is commensurate, is there?
Well, commensurate with what? What, a male perpetrator?
Well, no, not with a male perpetrator, but like there's no additional details I could give you that's going to make you think, well, yeah, a year's post-detention, 100 hours of community work seems fine for that crime, right? Like as I described it.
Wrong with that crime, but for it to be commensurate, you'd have to, with a male perpetrator, I'd have to actually be able to compare it to a similar case with a male perpetrator, an actual genuine case. Yeah, that's the thing. I don't know enough about that case to make a judgment. Obviously, I don't think that's an appropriate sentence. It's ridiculous, but for me to judge it fairly and from an informed perspective, I'd need to know why that sentence was given.
Okay. But you did say that you think that it is, to some extent, that there is some bias. You are agreeing that there is a bias against men in the in sentencing.
Yeah, I would say that.
Right. And I mean, so is that something that you would be interested in supporting? Is that if there were a movement to do something about that, taking the issue of exactly what to do about it off the table for a second, like, is that something that you'd be in favor of trying to address?
Yeah, I do think there needs to be reform on that basis.
Okay.
Yeah.
There do seem to be quite a lot of issues that so far. I think, I'm not sure, yeah, every single one we've brought up so far seems to have been something that everyone's sort of been on the same page with, at least in this hangout, right?
Yeah, so
Pretty
should
much
we
when it
change?
gets down to it, it seems like it.
So should we change gears and talk about those things which are standing in our way from working together?
Okay, then.
Well, I can say as an MRA, there is just an incredible amount of misinformation and bullshit published about us constantly on the internet, which makes it very, very difficult to do actual activism and get things done. So, you know, constantly being compared to the pickup artists and people like Elliot Rodger, who had no connection to the men's rights movement, being told that you're a fundamentalist Christian who's against abortion, or being told that you're anti-trans, and it's an endless list of misinformation and strawmen and in many cases outright lies. And it makes it not only hard to spread awareness, because you're trying to talk about, you know, these issues, because you're all the time trying to defend yourself and to put out these spot fires that keep popping up. But it also makes it very hard to work with the other side when they're doing nothing but lying about you and spreading misinformation. Some of it, I think, is people who have just been misinformed and they're just spreading that misinformation without doing proper research, and they've made up their minds. But I think a lot of it is deliberate.
True, but I think, to be honest, I think a lot of the time I don't find a lot of MRAs that sympathetic.
Okay.
I think it's so. I don't think. I mean, obviously, I do agree with a lot of the issues that MRAs bring up, and the reasons why they campaign on certain things and raise certain issues. But I don't. I mean, I think certain ways. I think there are some MRAs that don't always help themselves. I mean, you see them accuse, say, groups or people like feminists as being overly reactionary and illogical, or being unsympathetic themselves, being quite solipsistic in the way they campaign about certain things or address certain issues, but then end up resorting to the exact same behaviours, which doesn't exactly help.
Well, Diane, I mean, it seems there that you just said that MRAs are often, you find them unsympathetic, and one of the ways in which they are is them accusing feminists of being unsympathetic.
Yeah, that's my point. It's often quite hypocritical. Obviously, you get that in any kind of group, but I think to some extent the image, I think it doesn't exactly help its own PR. I think it could do with a PR makeover, although to be fair, I think feminism could to some extent as well.
I would agree that it could use a PR makeover, definitely. I think that there is, I mean, if you Google MRA, men's rights activists, then you're going to see quite a lot of anti-MRA stuff. But I'm unconvinced that this is a problem that's caused primarily by men's rights activists. Because whenever I ask which MRAs specifically are making the movement look bad, people will say something like, well, Roosh V or Elliot Rodgers, and it's people who have never claimed to be part of the MRA movement, and no one has ever claimed that they are.
Or they'll just say, just look at them, and you'll say, who? Give me an example. Well, I don't have to give you an example. You go and just look at them.
True, there are some, not all men's rights activists. Obviously, some people are just, hangers-on who just latch onto the MRM label to have something to define themselves by. But then at the same time, I think...
Diane, I don't think you're listening to us. The point we're making is that the examples which are used aren't MRAs. They're not people who identify... They don't identify as MRAs. They don't advocate for men's rights. In many cases, they actually are against us and actively speak out against us, yet somehow they're still labelled as MRAs. Roosh V is the perfect example of that.
I'm talking about actual MRAs, certain ones. I mean, if you take, for example, on A Voice for Men, you'll see, for example, an article about Duchamp, the practice in, I think, Afghanistan of boys being buggered and what have you. But then in an article that raises issues about male rape and male sexual abuse, you don't see necessarily any helplines or guidelines necessarily about where sufferers can go to if it's raised anything, you know, any issues, if they're sufferers themselves, the way you do is on certain sites that are feminist ones, certain articles about sexual abuse.
That's an interesting point. I should
think
point out
often-
that
Help, because that, I think, that would reinforce the, you know, the stance which many MRAs have about male abuse not being taken seriously and it not being dealt with enough by society.
I was just going to say, hopefully the next chat I do with you, Diane, is also going to be with Paul Elam. So that would be an interesting point to bring up.
Yeah, one example it has been that. And that's the stuff that I find quite interesting, especially because it isn't taken seriously. And it's often, for a lot of men, the reason why they take up the MRM cause. It has been because they've got issues in their own life, certain incidents of sexual abuse or physical abuse, what have you, that haven't been addressed, that have been overlooked due to chauvinism or whatever bullshit idea society has, that has actually drawn them to the MRM, you know? So, I mean, that's just it. I mean, obviously there are other, you know, reasons for, I mean, I'm talking about specifically about certain incidents of seeing MRAs. You know, I mean, obviously it's not all the MRAs that are responsible, but I think a lot of the time when you see comments by people who claim to be, not the rouge fee or what have you, is that there's a certain narrative that isn't being, I don't think it's being attacked enough so that a genuine representation of what it's about, the movement is about, is allowed to flourish. I don't think that it's done enough. Or maybe it just isn't you.
The thing is that I haven't actually seen these examples. I mean, I often get told that, oh, well, but there are some MRAs who, I don't know, harass women or something like that, or they say just some very nasty things. But I never get an example given to me, with the exception sometimes of some anonymous comments of people who, I mean, who have never claimed to be MRAs. Or I suppose also the examples of like Ruth Fee and Elliot Rodgers, which, I mean, again, who have never claimed to be MRAs. Do you have, I mean, would you be able to name a name or something of someone you think is quite negative for our movement, a figure of some kind?
Commenters online, but then again, I've just used the example of A Voice for Men. You know, I read an article on Abachabazi, and they were mentioning how feminists don't care about boys being abused, sexually abused only a problem when girls are and what have you. But then you don't see any advice lines or direction towards services for male survivors of sexual abuse, the way you have done in articles by women about sufferers.
I mean, partially that's because there aren't any in most of those cases. There very often aren't the services for men that there are for women.
No, but in Britain there have been by feminist writers like Grace Dent, and they'll have lines, you know, where to go for, you know, if you suffer from sexual abuse, and they'll have a male equivalent in case male sufferers don't feel comfortable about, you know, are scared of being turned away. And that's even been mentioned in certain articles I've read about how, you know, males have been turned away from certain refugees because it's, say, women only, or from certain support groups because they're women only. But then there's always helpline addresses, links, what have you, to services that will either take both men and women or that are directed towards men. But then you don't necessarily see that on certain MRA sites. I read one on Bachabazi. There wasn't anything I could see about male, you know, survivors or abuse. And why is that for a site that's meant to be literally a voice for men that are suffering?
Well, I think that the article would have, I mean, I haven't seen it specifically, but it would have been really more about discussing the issue and the implications thereof in terms of men's rights, as opposed to some outreach. Now, that being said, I do quite agree with you that some outreach in when it's possible, like in that situation, when you've got an article about men's rights. If you could have some outreach to accompany that, give male survivors of sexual abuse somewhere to go, that is a good idea, and it's something that I think I would hope men's sites would implement. The thing, though, is that, not providing that outreach on some articles, while I do agree with you on it that it would be something good to do, I don't think that it justifies the incredibly negative view of men's rights activists that a lot of people seem to have.
Yeah, it doesn't justify it, but I'm giving one incident where that I think in some ways is to some extent a fair criticism of an actual MRA incident, if you will.
Sure.
That is, the MRM it does have a very good reputation, but then that's the question of is why.
The reason I would say is because of the things that people tend to say about it, generally feminists. Not to say that it is all feminists doing it, but I can certainly point to a lot of feminist sites that will cite, as we've said a few times already, will cite Ruth V or Elliot Rodgers as a feminist, or will, as I was searching about this one and I found that article describing Paul Elam apologizing for domestic violence when he was actually condemning it, making these sorts of claims about men's rights activists. I can provide lots of instances of feminists doing this, whereas I can't find any instances of men's rights activists actually engaging in these behaviors.
That's true, but I think part of the reason why it's suffered is because it's meant to be about promoting men's rights, but then I think a lot of the time, a lot of the discussion you get from within the MRM is more about countering feminists and women rather than necessarily devoting enough attention towards improving the lot of men.
But there is a reason for that, Diane. As we were talking earlier about, as we
about reversing injustices, I can understand that, but the issue, but then what that leads people to think is that, well, what's the purpose of this movement? It's really about elevating the condition of men and giving them the rights they deserve, or is it just about bashing women and not diverting too much attention away from what could actually make men's lives better?
But Diane, when we were talking about domestic violence before, we were talking about the Duluth model, right? Mm-hmm. So the Duluth model is basically built on the model of the male aggressor and the female victim. So when you have feminism, which basically controls the gender narrative across the Western world, putting forward something like that, how are we supposed to change public opinion if we don't criticize the Duluth model and feminism?
I don't see anything wrong in criticizing the Duluth model and feminism, but then at the same time, where are the suggestions about, well, what you actually do to get rid of it? Criticizing is all very well, but then what do you do to actually, I don't think a lot of the time, the activism of the MRM, you don't see enough given to what is actually going to overturn that model, not just in terms of the criminal justice system and legally, but in terms of socially, because feminists might be decrying it and saying, oh yeah, we're the feminist model, but there's a lot of people who don't identify with feminists who are responsible for this belief that men are the aggressors and that women are not. Are you telling me there aren't chauvinists who believe in, the delicate little lady who wouldn't fight?
Of course there are. Of course there are. I often find that the extremes of of feminism often mirror the extremes of the right wing.
Well, yeah, radical feminism, yes, but then that's the thing, is that it's all very well just criticizing. It's the solution. Quite frankly, I think, like I was talking about the theatrics of antagonism, some people enjoy the pissing and moaning, but not the constructive behaviors or actions that will actually lead to not just getting rid of injustice, but even making the MRM movement a credible political force.
I don't think that doesn't seem quite fair to say that it's pissing and moaning. I think we've already said in this hangout that one of the primary things, the most important things, is start off by changing the culture, changing minds. And the way you do that is by talking about things and trying to have conversations. And I think initially that is what happens a lot.
Yeah, I didn't say it was just about pissing and moaning. I said some. And what my point is not that people are just doing that, but they're doing it to no end. They're doing it, they're ruminating, but not actually doing anything that gets towards a solution. Nothing that really helps apart from regurgitating the same thing. Of course, you have to criticize, but then there comes a point where you say, okay, I've done the criticizing. What am I actually going to do to act on this criticism and makes it worthwhile?
Well, yeah, but often those people that just criticize aren't MRAs, they're anti-feminists. Not all anti-feminists are MRAs. In fact, a lot of anti-feminists are against the men's rights movement.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, and also, I mean, I must say from a British perspective, I think there are, I mean, if you look at, say, British men who have aligned themselves with MRM or even MGTOW, I think a lot of them, obviously they have grievances, but then I think a lot of them, it's just jumping on a bandwagon for them. They do it for the same reasons as the killer clown bullshit that happened in October. You know, they don't necessarily take it as seriously, whereas there are obviously some others that do.
I might agree with you if you said anti-feminist, but the fact that you said MRA, I would have to disagree, because that's a whole different level.
True, but then there are some British MRAs who've never even heard of the NOW, will know nothing of the fissure between that and the men's movement with Dr. Warren Farrell and the likes of Paul Elam.
There are certainly, in any movement, going to be some people who are sort of just along for the ride. I totally agree with that. However, I would say that it tends to be uncommon amongst MRAs, and the reason is this. Even amongst anti-feminists, as Bane was pointing out, there's a lot of pushback against calling yourself an MRA. People who actually do adopt that label and actually do specifically advocate for men's issues, as opposed to just saying why they don't like feminism, they get an enormous amount of pushback, and it really seems to be something that someone has to make a serious decision to start supporting. It's not something that there is that I think is conducive to a lot of bandwagoning, although there is going to be some of it, absolutely.
Well, yes, I know, but I think if you take the American wing of the movement, I think there are certain reasons why it developed there that are not necessarily specific to other countries. You know, for example, Britain has never had NOW, or it may have had an equivalent to a much smaller degree, but nothing. It has never had an organisation like the NOW. There
are certainly region-specific issues. Yes.
You did have the feminists come into Erin Pittsey's shelter in the 70s and basically force her out, and then protest her every time she tried talking somewhere, and send bombs to bomb threats to her house.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there is negative forms of feminism everywhere. I'm not saying that all feminists are like that, by the way, but there is definitely regional reasons why people would be anti-feminists.
Yeah, that's fair enough. They're entitled to be.
So how do we go about changing that then? If we want to change society's attitudes towards men's issues, then we need to start talking about them, and it's quite hard when with all the negativity. I mean, I think talks like this are a good start, but what else do we do?
Oh, she's gone on mute.
Yeah, I noticed that. I don't know. She might be having a technical issue. So either of you two want to answer that while we're waiting for Diane to come back?
Drink. Bear with me. Yeah, I think the talking thing is really good, obviously. And I guess we just need to find ways to kind of organize that better and bring that forward into more real life stuff and keep it going.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a serious problem with the working together thing, that is essentially that the public perception of both of these movements is actually quite bad. I mean, I think that feminism for good reason and the men's rights movement for bad reason. But whatever your position on whether the reasons are good or bad, it's just like a lot of people don't like feminism, although it does have some political power. A lot of people don't like it. You know, so I think 7% of British women identify as feminist, and the men's rights movement obviously has an even worse reputation.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like what Diane was saying before about people having a negative perception of the MRM or of particular members of it that might, you know, not be open to discussion or might give it a bad image, however valid that is or not, however common that is or not. I mean, I think on both that exists to some extent on both sides, but it's just we shouldn't. Those of us who do want to actually discuss things and progress them, just don't focus on it. You know, just make an effort to focus on talking to people where you're actually going to get somewhere.
Right. Yes, actually trying to get some
being
political
like some stupid commenter, you know.
Yes. I mean, I agree with that. I don't want to say that I think that just the conversations and arguing on the internet, etc., isn't valuable, because I actually think it is. I think that you know, memes on the internet got Donald Trump elected. They can certainly do something for men's issues as well.
I'm not trying to say that sort of arguing on the internet isn't worthwhile, because I definitely think that it is.
Yeah. So, but in terms of the actual political activism, there does seem to be a real problem, which I think is sort of the crux of what was trying to get at in the second half of this hangout, where when men's rights advocates do their advocacy, then they tend to have a very difficult time because of the feminist pushback. Now, I don't. If there are any legitimate women's rights abuses, I don't think that I have seen the same in the other direction. That I don't think that I've seen men's rights advocates come out against fixing a women's rights issue when it does occur. Like, for example, female genital mutilation. I haven't seen a subset of MRAs who complain about that.
I think you're totally right about that. When there is an obviously very serious and real issue, I don't see any number of MRAs that are kind of coming out against it and trying to say that it shouldn't be talked about or it shouldn't be, you know, nothing should be done about it.
Right.
I don't see that.
Yeah, so it does seem to be only in the other direction, which is that when men's rights advocates try to push for something, with the obvious example there being the men's shelters in the UK that Bane was just talking about, where as soon as they try some men's issue starts to get dealt with, there is a strong feminist pushback.
I can't really understand why that is, unless there's some component to what's being suggested that they think is going to negatively affect women in some way. I can't see why that happens.
Well,
and usually I don't think there is.
Even here in Australia, we have the men's sheds, and there's been a feminist pushback against that.
Oh God, really? They seem so innocent and...
Yeah, exactly. It's good for men to go there and spend time together and, you know, do something constructive and talk
What are
and
they
whatever.
saying? What are the feminists
Well, it's
that
not
are against saying is
inclusive.
the issue?
It's not inclusive of women.
Well, that's
True.
you can't
And
have
this is something I often see
women's
when
only
it's
spaces and then
Yeah,
and then not
when it's a
allow
women's-
men's only.
when it's a women's only space, that's perfectly fine because women need their own space. But when it's a
Yeah,
men's
they
only
need a place
space,
to escape the men's.
it's sexist because it's not inclusive of women, and it's an incredible double standard.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but I think also, but then there are some men, I think there was even one MRA who actually agreed with that kind of male-only space. I think it was man cave. It was something it's something that's mandated from the wife. You know, it's something that your wife allows you to have, that man cave, that man space, and that's why he didn't believe in it.
No, the men's shed is like it's a privately funded space where men go and they teach each other carpentry skills and make things for the community. It's not like someone's private shed down the back. It's
Things.
it's a community thing where men can go and bond and talk and do something constructive and give back to the community.
This particular man didn't believe in that kind of male bonding, male-only space. I've even heard men say they don't believe in it. I personally don't have a problem with it, especially because I think friendships are a personal thing. You choose your friends who you spend your personal time with. So I don't really see where the law should come into that, quite frankly.
So you've said that a few times that you don't really have a problem with men's rights issues. In fact, you seem to have agreed with us mostly on all of them. Another thing that you mentioned, Diane, was that you thought that sometimes men's rights activists aren't criticizing some of their more negative elements enough.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you think that feminists criticize their more negative elements sufficiently?
No, I don't. I don't think that happens enough. But it's nature. No one likes to be criticized. You want to see yourself as being, above reproach. I think that's actually one way in which I guess the good thing about feminists and MRAs working against each other, each can act as a force of scrutiny. Each can question the other and perhaps hold each to account.
Yeah, I think you need that counter voice as long as it's fair criticism.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. But then I think internal criticism is important as well.
Yeah, of course. I think you need both.
Mm.
I don't mind fair criticism of the men's rights movement. My problem is when it's bullshit criticism. Criticize us for things that we've said or done. Don't criticize us for things that other people who aren't part of the movement have said or done. I mean, I think that's fair.
Yeah, I think that in terms of fixing or trying to tackle some of these sort of inequality issues with both men's rights activists and feminists, I think that one of the most important things to get there is for, I suppose, for feminists to start doing more to weed out the feminists who are against all of these men's rights issues that you seem in favor of here, Diane.
We could say weed out, or just a case of dissociate from them. Sometimes, like you said, some you'll get on with, some you can work with, others that you can't.
Yeah, but I think if that were done more publicly, it would go a long way to helping with feminism's image.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's to an extent, though. I think a question is what sells, what's trendy and what's sexy. And I think certain narratives they're more easily publicized, and they sell stories,
Sure.
column inches more than others. You know, I mean, it's like that one of the, you know, the young man that can't get laid and lives in his, you know, lives with his mum is a popular one of MRMs, even though obviously there's a wide range of men who are part of the movement and women as well. So, I mean, personally, I can say that I don't really care about the image because for me, it's a matter of principle.
Yeah, and I see what you mean with that. Like, I mean, if you take the worst example of a feminist, the one that just says sort of the stupidest thing you could think of, they're the one that's going to have a story about them go viral. And so it's definitely challenging to kind of counter all of that.
I don't think it's, I think you've got a point. I mean, I think one thing that I like about men's activism in Britain until recently is that it has been to some extent issue-based, and I think in some ways that's really helped. You know, you have, say, the Fathers for Justice and male suicide and what have you, because then I think it's allowed people to see that it's not just about men against women, but it's about certain specific issues which are hurting men. You see, I think it's a case of people have seen the issue first, then the fact that it's affecting men second, and I think in a way that it's helped, because I think the problem with saying it's a men's rights thing, women's thing, is that it automatically, people jump to seeing it as a battle of the sexes thing. You know, regardless of why the argument or is happening or what the content of the debate or issue is. And I think that's really helpful. I think as well, especially with the Fathers for Justice thing, the fact that it's about, you know, men choosing to be responsible fathers and husbands and what have you, personalizes the issue. I think it personalizes the image of what these men dressed as Batman are fighting for. And I think that's really helped. I think that's an example of successful activism. Although maybe the costumes maybe not so much, but I think that's one thing, one aspect of activism that I personally, that I think does work, or that has worked to some extent.
They still get criticism, though, from feminists. I recently heard Jess Phillips criticising them.
Yes, I mean, true, but there have been some like really militant ones, you know, ones that have committed crimes, you know, while doing their protests, and that I don't agree with.
No, she was referring to the ones dressed as Spider-Man who I think climbed up on, where did they climb up? Was it Parliament or?
Buildings. I don't think you need to break into buildings. I think there's one in particular, I've forgotten what he was dressed as, that broke into somewhere. I don't think that's necessary. I believe in lawful protest, but I do agree with what they're fighting for.
Oh, look, I do agree that lawful protest is the best way to go about it, but I have to wonder if they did that to get publicity because no one was listening. Hello?
Oh, got mute again.
What happened there?
Yeah.
I don't know.
But yeah, quite possibly.
So I have to wonder if there's a movement which is trying to get heard.
Yeah, I do. It might have getting publicity, but it could just be desperation. I mean, that's a lot of the time. It's not just about getting, you know, the media's attention, but that of the ex-wife or the mother of the children. And I think in a way that's where I think in a way lets down, because then you're taken away from the logic of you being able to see your child, and it's just about manipulation. You know, you're using manipulation to put your point across and get what you want, rather than actual principle and having right on your side as a father, or as a parent, I should say.
I have to wonder, though, if new movements have to be a bit radical to get heard. Otherwise, you know, they tend to get drowned out or unknown.
Well, do you think there's going to be like an MRA equivalent of Femen or something? You know?
No, but I mean, during the suffrage movement, there was I can't think of her name, the woman who ran in front of the horses.
Yeah,
in
Emily.
the horse race.
Yeah, Emily Davis. Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason why she did that was to get publicity and to get heard, to get the movement heard. I wonder if that's a necessary evil with new movements.
True. Although I think, yeah, I mean, you have to do something that will get people's attention and that is memorable. Although the issue, I think, with my issue with the whole Father Justin breaking into things is that, yes, it is publicity, but then I wonder if it's not a part of manipulation, on the, to see the children. If you don't let me see the kids, I'll do this to myself. The same way, a partner who's scared of their wife or whatever, or girlfriend or boyfriend leaving them, says, if you leave me, I'll kill myself to make the person stay. Is it just about manipulation or what?
Or it could be desperation too, if they haven't seen their kids.
I agree. I agree.
So we've been going almost 2 hours. Should we go on or start wrapping up? I'll leave it up to you guys.
Well, I'll have to leave soon because I need to go out, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. I think we've sort of got through the meat of everything there. I mean, it seems that we overall agree on many of the men's rights issues there, and I do think that. So, for example, as I was saying, just when you were away there for a bit, Diane, that I've never seen a men's rights activist come out against, for example, female genital mutilation being stopped. I mean, I think that the way for men's rights activists and feminists to be able to start working together would be for feminists to start, I suppose, calling out the aspects of their movement which are against men's rights.
Okay.
Yeah,
I was just sort of a sum up of where I've sort of come to after the conversation.
So, Emma, you're part of a group which is it feminists and MRAs working together?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do think it would be really helpful if people could see more calling out on both sides, probably. The group that I'm in is Against the Odds. It's on Facebook, and there are a bunch of feminists in the group, there are a bunch of MRAs in the group, there are people like myself who are kind of in the middle, and we just talk about this stuff. We're working on producing some videos about the different issues, and it's been a good time so far. There's been quite a few people that initially their reaction to it was along the lines of, oh, I bet this is just a sneaky feminist conspiracy where they get you in and then over time they try to kind of convert you to their way of thinking and convince you of all their positions on things. But that really hasn't been the case. I don't know, unless they're playing a really, really long con on us. But it's been all good so far.
Well, that's
we
one
kind of
thing.
just focus on the issues and don't bring in, feminist theory or any of that
good
stuff.
I think that's one of the things that prevents us working together is, as an MRA, I've often heard, men have issues, but it's just because of the patriarchy, or it's all men's fault anyway.
Right, yeah. And so the way we kind of work on it is there may be feminists in the group that have that position, but it's just not something that we really discuss. So say if we're discussing suicide, then we just talk about suicide and what we think can be actually done about it, as opposed to the higher level kind of why is this even a problem type of thing.
That's good. That's positive. Once again, one of the things I often hear, or just about always hear when I bring up male suicide, or someone brings up male suicide, is women attempt it more often, which is actually a false statistic.
Oh, okay.
It's not true, but you hear it all the time.
Mhm.
Women self-harm more, but self-harm isn't
Right.
always suicide attempts.
So, in those studies that were saying that they attempt suicide more often, was that basically an issue of they were taking what was really just self-harm as a suicide attempt, or?
From memory, it was the CDC figures, and they just collected self-harm figures. They didn't break it down into
Right, okay.
suicide or or whatever.
So they
'Cause
just
there's-
collected self-harm, and then they also,
and then it's
showed
been
what amount of that resulted in a death.
sorry, what was that?
So they just collected self-harm figures, and then as a
Yep.
subset of that, how many resulted in a death?
No. The argument is women attempt it more. So
Yeah,
obviously it's not a completed suicide, but
yeah,
what they've basically done is taken all the self-harm figures and just assumed that they're suicide attempts.
right.
And
So-
suicide's actually a subsection of self-harm.
Mm.
So it might be 90%, it could be 10%. We don't know.
Yeah.
But it's not really a proper counter argument when you're talking about male suicide,
Yeah,
which
and
is 4 times as high or
It's not
something,
to
4 or
say
5.
that self-harm isn't a serious issue, in in itself, but it's definitely a problem when you bring up the male suicide rate, and the instant reaction is, oh, but women attempt it more, or they self-harm more, or whatever it is. There's no need to deflect like that.
But then isn't the
We can discuss both.
Exactly.
Right, it's not about determining who has it worse, it's about looking at issues that exist and how best to solve them, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good way of going about it. It avoids the ideology getting in the way of actual activism.
Yeah.
You were going to say something, Diane?
I was going to say that isn't the reason partly why male suicide rate is high is because men are more likely to choose violent methods, such as throwing themselves.
I think that's partly why. So the question is, I guess, why are women less likely to use those methods?
Well, yeah. I do. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why. I think it's partly because men are more, in some ways, they're more likely to be risk takers.
I think when a man decides he's going to commit suicide, he's more committed to it. Basically, it's it's not like I guess taking an overdose of pills and then calling a friend or something. Not that I'm suggesting that all female attempts are like that, but I think there is probably a percentage.
Sure, some of them would definitely. So some attempted suicides are cries for help. And the question is, which gender do you think is more likely to want to make a cry for help? And I would argue that I would expect, on average, women would be more likely to do that. Not that most female suicides are cries for help, or attempted suicides are cries for help, but just that it would contribute to some extent towards that discrepancy in the number between men and women killing themselves.
I don't know. I mean, has there been a study? Well, I don't know. Well, that's the thing, is that it's hard to get a study on, because obviously you're not going to ask a dead person why they killed themselves. No, I think there's a lot of reasons. Yeah, I mean, who knows? I think that's a mystery. I'm certainly not going to. I'm not going to pass judgment as to why. I mean, all I know is about the methods.
Yeah, I think
you're more likely to die than if you slit your wrist.
I think another factor is after a divorce, fathers tend to lose their entire family, whereas women tend to, only lose a husband. Typically,
yeah, it's often because, unfortunately, a lot of husbands rely on their wife to maintain family friendships and social connections outside of the family. So
but it's also kids as well. It's also the kids.
Because it's the wife that maintained them, unfortunately.
Yeah, but it's also not only losing a wife, but also the kids.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Anyway, I think it's it's getting a bit too late to dive into suicide, because that's a whole show in itself, I think.
Yeah, probably.
But I think it's been a rather productive talk. Hopefully everyone's enjoyed it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've had a good time. I do think we've got somewhere on it.
Although I see that there's 19 downvotes on the video. And
Oh,
15
that's
upvotes.
fun. That's
They
Bundy
came
Bear. He
in
did it.
right away as well in like the first 15 minutes. It was quite.
Yeah,
I just
no,
suddenly realised there were 18 of them there.
No, it's Bundy Bear. He just has like 19 accounts and he just randomly downvotes stuff for some reason.
Really? I was wondering. I thought this was a productive talk, and then I saw the 19
Yeah.
Because
downvotes.
I was getting like,
No,
why are there
he's-
18 dislikes? No one's even said anything very controversial yet. But I see.
Yeah, he sometimes does it to my videos.
This was back
and
when
he
we were all
messages-
saying like, yeah, I disagree with male circumcision.
Well, that could be a factor for one or two, I guess. But it's
no,
rare
if
that I
there's
get-
19, that's exactly how many accounts Bundy has.
it's rare that I get 19 downvotes.
Yeah,
Well, it was good to talk to you all for the first time.
it's good to talk to you too.
Yeah, I'll get you back on at some point, Emma.
Cool. I'll try and be a bit more talkative that time. I just thought you guys had a good thing going there. I didn't want to break it up.
Well, I've had a long day, so I'm rather tired. So I'm probably not as coherent as I normally am. But anyway,
You're all good.
it's
Alright.
even later over there in New Zealand, isn't it? You're 2 hours
It is.
ahead of
Yeah,
me.
no, it's
Now
midnight.
Wednesday.
Yeah,
It's only Tuesday morning for you, Diane.
Yeah, it's 11, just 11.
Very respectable.
So, any final thoughts before we finish?
No, not from here. Yeah.
Oh, I think I pretty much summed up my thoughts on it. I think that generally there are a lot of feminists who are totally in favor of men's issues, and I think it's totally possible to work together on them. And I know that myself and all the MRAs I know would be totally happy to work on be in support of women's issues. If there's a legitimate human rights violation, then we'd be against that too. I think it's just calling out the crazies when we see them, who are sort of from who I think are stopping that kind of dialogue from happening.
Nice.
Yep, I guess that's a good note to end on. So, say goodbye, guys.
So yeah,
All
thanks for
right.
having us on, Ben.
Goodbye.